Boston, a city of history, power, and deep secrets. Behind the grand buildings and busy streets, another world exists. A world built on loyalty, control, and silent battles for dominance. This is the story of the gangs that shaped Boston's underworld, men who controlled the streets, who made and enforced their own rules. It wasn't just about money or influence, it was about survival. From the early days of street crews fighting for territory to the rise of well-organized crime families, Boston became a battleground where power shifted hands in the shadows. Deals were made in the back rooms of clubs and restaurants. Trust was rare, betrayal was everywhere. Some names became legends, some disappeared without a trace. But one thing remained constant: whoever held power had to fight to keep it. This is the untold story of Boston's most feared and powerful gangs. A story of ambition, control, and the cost of rising to the top. The Lucern Street Dogs, a notorious street gang, has earned a reputation for terrorizing Boston's Mattapan neighborhood, particularly in the Lucern Street area. Emerging in the early 2000s, the gang became known for its violent tendencies and unlawful activities. By 2006, they had firmly established their presence in the city's criminal landscape, being linked to 37 shootings, which accounted for approximately 10% of all shootings in Boston that year. This level of violence made them one of the most feared and discussed gangs in the area. The Lucern Street Dogs were often involved in disputes with rival groups, and the neighborhood quickly became a hotspot for crime. As with many gangs, their criminal activities revolved around illicit enterprises, with narcotics being a significant source of income. The gang's reach extended far beyond the streets of Mattapan, as their operations were deeply entangled with larger networks of narcotic trafficking and illegal firearms possession. This made them a central figure in the city's struggles with gang-related violence. One of the more infamous members, Travis Windley, gained attention in 2014 after an altercation with police during a traffic stop. When asked to exit a vehicle for a seatbelt violation, Windley, a known associate of the Lucern Street Dogs, was found to be carrying a revolver. His extensive criminal record, which included charges of assault, battery, and armed violence, painted a chilling picture of the gang's disregard for the law. Windley's resistance to arrest was indicative of the mindset cultivated within the gang, a willingness to confront authority with force. The hearing that followed was a testament to his violent past and the gang's tendency to resist law enforcement at all costs. This story was one of many that highlighted the gang's violent nature and their disdain for both the law and rival groups. In 2010, another gang member, James "Gunna" Walker, was convicted for his role in the shooting demise of Antoine Perkins. This incident occurred on Morton Street, a neighborhood heavily impacted by gang activity. Perkins, a 20-year-old local resident, was shot at close range while sitting on the steps of his home. Walker, a well-known member of the Lucern Street Dogs, approached Perkins and fired the fatal shots. The trial was a stark reminder of the brutality that the gang was capable of. The Lucern Street Dogs' connection to narcotics trafficking was undeniable. In the years that followed, a number of gang members were implicated in drug-related offenses, with arrests and indictments becoming increasingly frequent. In 2015, a significant investigation led to the indictment of 25 gang members involved in drug distribution and illegal firearms offenses. This investigation highlighted the extent to which the gang was entrenched in the illegal narcotic trade. Several members were caught with narcotics, and others were found in possession of firearms, further showcasing the gang's dangerous nature. The gang's involvement in these illicit activities created an environment where violence was often the solution to disputes and where firearms were seen as essential tools in maintaining power. Among the defendants was Lyric "Half-Dead" Greaves, a gang leader whose connection to the gang was notorious. Greaves was allegedly involved in several violent encounters and drug deals. In one incident, he was detained by law enforcement while fleeing the scene of a shooting, further cementing his role as a key figure in the gang's criminal endeavors. His charges included possession of firearms and involvement in narcotic distribution. The Lucern Street Dogs' influence in the criminal world continued until several of their members faced significant legal repercussions. Over time, arrests mounted, and many members of the gang were either incarcerated or removed from the streets. The federal government, local law enforcement, and the community worked together in an attempt to dismantle the gang's operations. Investigations and arrests over the years have chipped away at their power, but the remnants of their influence still lingered in the streets of Mattapan. One significant blow to the gang came with the arrest of multiple high-ranking members, including Eric E. Moneybags Davis. Davis, a close associate of Greaves, had been involved in several criminal incidents. He faced charges for illegal possession of a firearm and was suspected of being involved in numerous violent disputes. In one notable incident, Davis was allegedly involved in a shooting that left several people injured. His arrest, alongside several others, was a crucial step in neutralizing the gang's leadership and breaking its hold over the community. As of now, the Lucern Street Dogs are no longer the powerful force they once were. Many of their members have been arrested and sentenced, while others have either left the gang or fallen victim to the same violence they once perpetuated. Number 10. Esmond Street Gang. The Esmond Street Gang, an infamous group based in Boston, became notorious for its involvement in various illicit activities, most notably narcotics trafficking and violent confrontations. The gang's operations, particularly in the Dorchester neighborhood, marked a significant part of the criminal underworld in Boston. Its leaders and members carried out their illicit dealings with chilling precision, contributing to the area's reputation for being plagued by violent crime and narcotic-related incidents. The gang's roots trace back to the late 1990s, when the group began its dominance over the local narcotics trade. The Esmond Street area, a hotbed for criminal activity, became their turf. Their criminal network revolved around controlling the flow of illicit substances, primarily narcotic base, while maintaining a heavily armed presence to protect their interests. With their operations flourishing, the gang gained notoriety, not just for narcotic trafficking, but also for their violent response to anyone who dared encroach on their territory. Gerald Smith, a key figure associated with the Esmond Street crew, became a symbol of the gang's continued reign over the area. Smith, also known by his alias G-Man, was a longtime trafficker of narcotics in the region. He was frequently involved in selling illicit substances on Esmond Street, contributing to the gang's dominance in the local narcotic trade. Federal agents conducted a deep investigation into Smith's operations, which involved a combination of undercover officers and cooperating witnesses. These efforts led to Smith's arrest in 2014 after a thorough search revealed nearly a kilogram of prepared narcotics, ready for street-level distribution, and a loaded firearm, further cementing his position in the gang's criminal activities. His arrest and subsequent conviction on federal narcotic trafficking and firearm charges marked a significant blow to the gang, but it was far from the end of their reign. But Smith's case was not an isolated one. The gang's criminal network expanded its reach, drawing attention from law enforcement for its involvement in violent acts. A particularly chilling case came to light in 2001, involving a federal indictment that targeted several members of the Esmond Street crew. The indictment laid out how the gang had terrorized the Dorchester neighborhood, often clashing with rival factions over control of the local narcotics market. The rivalry between the Esmond Street crew and the Franklin Hill Giants led to multiple violent episodes, further staining the area's reputation. Among the gang's most notorious figures were Darrell Green and Brandon Morris. Both were implicated in a series of violent events, culminating in the execution of a young man, Terrell Gethers, at the 2001 Boston Caribbean Carnival. The tragic incident occurred during an event that was attended by thousands, showcasing the gang's disregard for public safety. The execution, one of several violent confrontations at the festival, led to further investigations into the gang's activities. As law enforcement worked tirelessly to gather evidence, Green and Morris were eventually arrested and charged with first-degree manslaughter. The Esmond Street crew's criminal empire, fueled by its violent nature and commitment to controlling the narcotics trade, did not go unnoticed by federal authorities. Prosecutors turned to racketeering laws to target the gang, giving them access to tougher penalties. As more arrests were made and investigations continued, the gang's criminal activities came into sharper focus. One of the key members, Edward Washington, became embroiled in another high-profile case. In 2006, Washington was acquitted of charges related to the gang's racketeering and conspiracy activities. Yet this did not signify the end of his ties to the group. Despite his acquittal, Washington's name continued to surface in relation to various incidents, including those involving the violent escalation of gang rivalries. The Esmond Street crew, however, was not immune to the long arm of the law. Several of its members, including Green, Morris, and Smith, faced lengthy prison sentences after their convictions, with some of them serving multiple terms for their repeated involvement in criminal activities. These convictions, however, did not fully dismantle the gang, as other members continued to operate in the shadows. The eventual downfall of the Esmond Street crew came in waves. While federal prosecutions and arrests removed some of the gang's key figures from the streets, the cycle of violence continued, fueled by the ongoing demand for narcotics and the gang's need to defend its interests. Law enforcement agencies, working in conjunction with local authorities, slowly started to suffocate the gang's operations. However, by the time they had a significant presence on the streets of Boston, the Esmond Street crew had already inflicted irreversible damage on the local community. By the mid-2010s, the Esmond Street gang's control over Boston had diminished, but their legacy lingered in the form of the violence and fear they had instilled in the neighborhoods they once ruled. Federal investigations had crippled their operations, but remnants of the crew still operated in the shadows. Although their reign of terror had officially ended, the ripples of their criminal activities were felt long after their convictions. As of now, many of the original members of the Esmond Street crew have either been sentenced to long prison terms or have gone into hiding. The gang, as a cohesive force, no longer operates with the same influence in Boston, but the memory of their violent activities and their influence over the narcotic trade still lingers in the city. Number 9. Orchard Park Trailblazers. The Orchard Park Trailblazers, a notorious street gang in Boston, made their mark in the city's criminal history in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Based in the Orchard Park housing projects of Roxbury, their rise was tied to a community riddled with poverty, narcotics, and violence. The group initially started as a local entity in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the 1980s that they began to entrench themselves in criminal activity. As the years progressed, the Orchard Park Trailblazers became infamous for their involvement in narcotic trafficking, illicit transactions, and clashes with rival groups. They would go on to shape the narrative of gang violence in Boston for decades to come. Throughout the 1990s, the Orchard Park Trailblazers engaged in an ongoing feud with the Columbia Point Dogs, a rival gang based in another part of Boston. This conflict, which was fueled by territorial disputes and control over narcotic trade routes, became a significant source of violence in the area. The rivalry was marked by a vicious back and forth, with both gangs attempting to dominate the streets of Roxbury and surrounding neighborhoods. The group gained further notoriety for their extensive involvement in the narcotics trade, which was prevalent in Boston in the 1980s and 1990s. The Orchard Park Trailblazers became a key player in distributing these illicit substances throughout the city. Their control over the Orchard Gardens housing development, one of the largest public housing projects in Roxbury, became an infamous hotbed for narcotic deals and criminal activity. The gang's power grew not only from the narcotics they peddled, but also from their ability to intimidate and control the neighborhood, often using violence to settle disputes and maintain dominance. Law enforcement began taking notice of the Orchard Park Trailblazers as early as the 1990s. By 1997, federal and local authorities launched a series of operations aimed at dismantling the gang's illicit substance network. This led to a significant indictment on April 11, 1997, when 14 members of the Orchard Park Trailblazers were charged with conspiracy and distribution of illicit substance. Their arrests marked a major moment in the battle between Boston's law enforcement and street gangs. The charges resulted in a coordinated series of raids in Roxbury and Dorchester aimed at disrupting the gang's grip on the community. The pressure on the Orchard Park Trailblazers didn't subside after their first major takedown. Law enforcement would continue to target them well into the 2000s. In June 2004, another round of arrests occurred during a 24-hour raid, with 15 gang members taken into custody. This raid was another in a series of attempts to cripple the gang's operations, sending a clear message that law enforcement was committed to eradicating gang violence and narcotic trafficking from Boston streets. Despite these efforts, the gang remained resilient, finding new ways to operate in the shadows. By 2017, the Orchard Park Trailblazers had made headlines again, this time with the arrests of Lyndon Scott a.k.a. Skizzy and Raoul Williams a.k.a. Booby. Both men, who were active members of the gang, pleaded guilty to distributing narcotic in and around Roxbury's Orchard Gardens housing development. Their guilty pleas followed a lengthy investigation into the gang's continued illegal activity, which involved multiple cooperating witnesses and undercover purchases of narcotics. This case, which was a culmination of nearly 2 years of investigative work, involved federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The investigation focused on the rampant criminal activity within the Orchard Gardens development, which was also located near neighborhood schools. The crimes committed by the Orchard Park Trailblazers were linked to a variety of criminal activities that included not only the trafficking of illicit substances, but also a growing pattern of violence. Members of the gang were known to be involved in a range of dangerous incidents, often leading to fatal consequences. As these violent acts escalated, the impact on the community grew more severe, leaving residents in a constant state of fear. By 2017, the Orchard Park Trailblazers were facing mounting legal consequences. Over the years, many of their members had been arrested, indicted, or executed. The gang's criminal empire had slowly started to crumble under the pressure of law enforcement, with many of its members either incarcerated or fleeing from the authorities. Among those arrested were not just street-level dealers, but higher-ranking members who were integral to the gang's operations. The 2017 arrests of Lyndon Scott and Raoul Williams were just the latest chapter in a long history of gang activity, but they also symbolized the shifting tides in Boston's battle against gang violence. The Orchard Park Trailblazers were known for their ability to adapt to the changing landscape of criminal activity. Over the years, their operations shifted from strictly narcotic trafficking to a more diversified criminal portfolio that included firearm sales and acts of intimidation. The gang's affiliation with other Boston area groups, such as the Vine Forest Street gangs, added a further layer of complexity to the city's street gang dynamics. Their willingness to engage in violence, coupled with their extensive narcotics trafficking network, made them one of the most dangerous and feared gangs in Boston. As of today, the Orchard Park Trailblazers no longer exist in the same form they once did. Many of their key members have either been arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Number 8. Cameron Street Gang. In the neighborhoods of Dorchester, Boston, a name once whispered with fear and distrust: the Cameron Street Gang. This group of individuals became notorious for their violent acts, illicit trade, and the chaos they spread throughout the city. Their presence loomed large, and their connection to violence, firearms, and narcotics painted a disturbing picture of their criminal activities. It was in the early 2000s and 10s that the gang began its rise to prominence. Cameron Street, a street nestled in Dorchester, quickly became synonymous with fear. The members, a mix of young men from the local community, sought to carve out their territory by any means necessary. The gang's power was not built merely on their illicit enterprises, but also on their willingness to use intimidation and violence to maintain control. Rivalries with other local groups intensified, particularly with the Wendover Street Gang, marking the start of a bitter and dangerous war that spilled over into the streets. This wasn't just a typical gang rivalry. The Cameron Street Gang used their position to engage in activities that spread across a wide array of illicit pursuits. Narcotics trafficking was their primary source of income, with Cameron Street members distributing large quantities of illicit substances, ranging from narcotics to illicit substances through the neighborhoods and cities surrounding Boston. They maintained a strong hold on their drug operations, fueling both their coffers and the violence they perpetuated. The gang's criminal behavior went far beyond trafficking. They engaged in a number of violent acts. Armed robberies, assaults, and home invasions became common tactics to assert dominance over rivals and intimidate anyone who might challenge their authority. They used firearms in many of their operations, often firing on rivals or those they saw as threats to their position. As much as their criminal pursuits were tied to narcotics, so too were their crimes tied to intimidation. The power of a firearm in their hands allowed them to eliminate perceived threats with impunity. The FBI, ATF, and Boston police were keenly aware of their activities and began an extensive investigation into the group. It was during this time that the first significant busts occurred, bringing some members of the gang under federal scrutiny. These arrests were part of a wider effort to dismantle violent criminal organizations operating throughout Boston. James Rodriguez, known as Bummy, was one such individual. As a key member of Cameron Street, he was implicated in distributing narcotics, particularly narcotics in the form of illicit substances. Rodriguez was directly involved in drug transactions, often operating out of a stash house in Somerville, Massachusetts. Law enforcement conducted controlled buys and, in one of the more significant seizures, uncovered nearly 400 grams of narcotics, packaging materials, and cash. This, however, was just a small piece of the puzzle. Rodriguez's actions were a direct reflection of the gang's systemic approach to maintaining control through their operations. Devontae Lopez, or D. Lopez, another Cameron Street member, engaged in similar activities. He was involved in trafficking narcotics, notably marijuana, which he imported through the mail system from California. The investigation revealed that Lopez used various methods to bring in substantial amounts of narcotics into Boston, sometimes exchanging the narcotics for large sums of money. His network extended across states, underlining just how far-reaching the Cameron Street Gang's operations had become. During the federal investigation, authorities uncovered additional links between Cameron Street members and firearms trafficking. Law enforcement agencies discovered weapons caches, including pistols and high-powered firearms, often hidden in secret compartments and stashes inside gang members' homes. These weapons were not just for protection, they were integral to the gang's ability to exert control and intimidation over the surrounding neighborhoods. The violence associated with Cameron Street was not limited to rival gang disputes. They engaged in brutal tactics to protect their turf, employing violent methods to eliminate or neutralize anyone who dared challenge their operations. The authorities took note of this, and it became clear that their approach was one of sustained terror, taking lives and ruining futures along the way. One particularly harrowing incident involved Duran Bethea, a member of Cameron Street, who was involved in the attempted shooting of a rival gang member. Bethea's violent actions weren't isolated, but part of the larger picture of the gang's power struggles. He was later sentenced to nearly 21 years in prison for his role in these violent acts and multiple home invasions. a stark reminder of the lengths to which the gang would go to preserve their dominance. As law enforcement tightened their grip, members of the Cameron Street gang began facing a range of charges. From narcotic trafficking to illegal firearms possession and violent crimes, the charges mounted. In 2024, James Rodriguez, along with Lopez, found themselves sentenced for their roles in the racketeering conspiracy tied to Cameron Street's operations. Rodriguez was sentenced to 42 months in prison for his involvement in distributing narcotics, while Lopez received a sentence of 60 months for his part in trafficking both narcotics and firearms. The authorities managed to arrest several members, but not all were apprehended. The gang's tentacles spread across various states, with members operating not only in Boston, but also in places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. Their reach extended far beyond the borders of Dorchester, creating a network of illegal activities that spanned multiple criminal industries. By the time the indictments came in, a significant portion of the gang had been caught in the web of federal law enforcement. Yet, despite the damage done, the story of the Cameron Street gang does not end there. While many of its key figures are behind bars, others remain free, and the question of whether the gang will survive in some form continues to linger. Number 7. Mission Hill Gang. The Mission Hill Gang is a notorious group that has long plagued the streets of Boston, with its roots stretching back to the 1980s. Operating primarily in the Mission Hill neighborhood, the gang has been a formidable force in the area, known for its criminal activities and deep connections to various illicit operations. The gang's primary activities revolved around street-level crimes, but over the years, it expanded its operations to involve narcotics trafficking, financial fraud schemes, and even violent confrontations with law enforcement. The Mission Hill Gang, based in the Mission, Maine and Annunciation Road housing developments, initially gained a reputation for its involvement in the narcotic trade, especially during the 1990s, when the area became notorious for narcotics distribution. It is believed that the gang's rise to prominence was driven by the chaos in the neighborhood, which created an ideal environment for organized crime to thrive. The gang was particularly known for its control over the local narcotic market, but as its influence grew, so did its criminal repertoire. In the past decade, the gang's criminal activities expanded beyond narcotics into financial fraud schemes, particularly involving the theft of checks and identity theft. The gang's ability to execute complex fraud operations, such as card cracking, a process in which they stole checks from postal collection boxes, chemically altered them, and deposited them into bank accounts controlled by recruited individuals, showcased their reach and resourcefulness. The gang's ability to exploit financial systems left a trail of victims across Boston, damaging not just individuals, but entire communities. Despite these fraud operations, it was the Mission Hill Gang's violent streak that truly defined its dangerous nature. The gang had a long-standing rivalry with other Boston-based groups, such as the Heath Street and H-Block gangs, which often led to violent confrontations. These clashes contributed to an increase in shootings, assaults, and other violent incidents in the city. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Mission Hill Gang was their brazen disregard for public safety, often engaging in violent actions without provocation. This was evident in cases where innocent people were caught in the crossfire of gang wars. The culmination of years of investigation into the gang's activities came in February 2024, when federal authorities unsealed charges against several members and associates of the Mission Hill Gang, marking a significant milestone in the efforts to dismantle their operations. Federal prosecutors charged 9 individuals for their involvement in the gang's extensive financial fraud scheme. The case stemmed from a multi-year investigation that tracked their movements and uncovered the full extent of their criminal enterprise. In addition to the financial crimes, other members of the Mission Hill Gang were linked to a series of violent incidents that further cemented their reputation as a dangerous group. The charges filed against them ranged from conspiracy to commit wire fraud, theft of government property, and possession of stolen mail, to more violent offenses related to the gang's ongoing turf wars. Among the individuals arrested were several gang members, including Imanol Rios Franco, Jairo Cabral Santos, and Jonathan Martinez, who were all charged with fraud and conspiracy related to the theft and laundering of funds. Their activities were not just confined to Boston, but spanned across various regions, involving a network of associates who helped execute the gang's illicit operations. The gang's involvement in fraud schemes was not just about stealing money, but also about creating a network of operations designed to launder funds and create a financial infrastructure that could sustain their illegal operations for years. The fact that they were able to manipulate and exploit financial systems further highlighted the complex nature of their criminal enterprise. By stealing checks, laundering money through recruited bank account holders, and purchasing postal money orders to transfer funds, the Mission Hill Gang demonstrated its capacity to cause widespread damage to the financial system. One of the key reasons that the Mission Hill Gang became so dangerous was their ability to maintain control over a large area while operating under the radar of law enforcement for extended periods. Their influence extended well beyond the streets, with some members even able to manipulate systems within prisons, smuggling illicit substances into the correctional facilities using creative methods, such as soaking paper with synthetic narcotics and mailing them in as legal documents. This revealed how deep and widespread the gang's operations were, extending from street corners to the state's prison system. The law enforcement response to the Mission Hill Gang was both persistent and meticulous. Working in collaboration with local, state, and federal agencies, authorities were able to piece together a massive network of criminal activity that involved not just narcotic trafficking, but a wide array of fraudulent financial operations and violent crimes. Investigators noted that the gang's ability to evade detection for so long was due to their secrecy and the fear they instilled in the community. The turning point for the gang came when a multi-agency effort led to the arrest of several key members. Among those arrested were Imanol Rios Franco and Jairo Cabral Santos, two prominent figures in the Mission Hill Gang's financial fraud scheme. As part of their operations, these individuals had recruited a network of bank account holders to launder money and make fraudulent transactions. The evidence collected in the investigation painted a vivid picture of the gang's illegal activities, showing how they exploited both individuals and institutions to further their own criminal interests. Federal prosecutors were keen to make an example of the Mission Hill Gang, sending a clear message that their criminal activities would no longer go unchecked. The indictment marked a turning point in Boston's ongoing battle against gang violence and organized crime, and served as a warning to other gangs operating in the area. The case demonstrated the importance of collaboration between local and federal law enforcement agencies who had spent years gathering intelligence, tracking the gang's movements, and building a case that would ultimately lead to their downfall. While some members of the gang have already been arrested and are facing charges, the full scope of the investigation continues. As of today, several members of the Mission Hill Gang remain in custody, with many awaiting trial. Their sentences could range from years in prison to life, depending on the severity of the charges they face. However, the arrest of these individuals does not mark the end of the gang's story. Number 6. Lenox Street Boys. Gang. The Lenox Street Boys, also known as the Lenox Street Cardinals, emerged as one of Boston's most formidable and dangerous street gangs, their origins tracing back to the Lenox Street housing projects in Roxbury. Situated in a neighborhood fraught with poverty and social strife, the gang quickly grew to dominate the region through illicit trade and violence. As one of Boston's oldest street organizations, they became notorious for their ruthless tactics, drawing the attention of both local police and federal authorities. By the mid-1980s, the Lenox Street Boys had begun to carve out their territory, their influence expanding not just within Boston, but into the larger landscape of regional criminal activities. Initially, the gang's operations were centered on street-level narcotics dealing. They were involved in the trafficking of narcotics and firearms, their activities spurred by an insatiable thirst for power and control over the neighborhood. Over time, the Lenox Street Boys became known for their brazen acts of intimidation and violence. They clashed with rival gangs, including groups tied to narcotic Lord Darrell Whiting, a name that resonated across New York and Boston for its association with serious criminal undertakings. On August 16, 1991, the Lenox Street Boys became involved in a high-profile altercation that would further solidify their reputation for violence. 3 members of the gang found themselves in a deadly confrontation with a well-known member of the Columbia Point Dogs, another notorious gang from Boston. The event took place in Ramsey Park, where a fierce exchange of gunfire between the two groups resulted in the injury and demise of several individuals. The Lenox Street Boys fled the scene, but the retaliation by the Columbia Point Dogs was swift and severe. This shooting set off a chain of retaliatory actions, marking the beginning of a cycle of violence that would characterize the gang's existence for years to come. Their activities weren't limited to street-level skirmishes. The gang's influence was widespread, and their network involved the distribution of illicit substances, firearms, and the implementation of fear tactics across the Lenox Street housing projects. Their impact was felt not only in the south end of Boston, but also in neighboring areas where their trade in illegal narcotics reached new heights. As the gang grew, so too did their power, attracting a wide range of individuals to their cause, from young, impressionable youths to seasoned criminals. The Lenox Street Boys established themselves as a dominant force, creating an atmosphere of intimidation and unease wherever they operated. Despite their rising power, the Lenox Street Boys were not immune to law enforcement attention. By 2011, authorities had launched a coordinated effort to dismantle the gang's operations. In a highly publicized raid that year, Boston police arrested 21 individuals, most of whom were allegedly involved in narcotic trafficking and gun violence. This marked the first major blow to the Lenox Street Boys, but it was far from the end of their reign. In 2016, a more extensive investigation into the Lenox Street Boys culminated in a large-scale operation. Federal and state authorities raided the Lenox Street housing project once again, arresting 27 individuals. Among those arrested, many were linked directly to the Lenox Street Cardinals, the gang's most active and violent faction. The charges included the distribution and possession of narcotics, firearms, and the illegal sale of weapons. Authorities had spent over a year investigating the gang, and by the time the raids took place, the Lenox Street Boys were identified as one of Boston's top 10 hotspots for violence. Between March 2012 and June 2015, over 30 shootings were reported in the area, a chilling reality to the ongoing strife caused by the gang's presence. Among the arrested individuals were figures with monikers like Shiz, Percy, and Bleed, individuals whose names had become synonymous with violence in the streets of Boston. The gang's operations spanned far beyond simple narcotic sales. They were integral to the illegal arms trade as well, further enhancing their notoriety. Prosecutors noted that the Lenox Street Boys had been trafficking a range of narcotics, all while maintaining an iron grip on their neighborhood through intimidation and fear. With the involvement of weapons, including firearms, the Lenox Street Boys added another layer of danger to their already volatile existence. Law enforcement described the neighborhood as being under siege, with residents constantly living in fear of the violence that could erupt at any moment. The 2016 arrests were a significant moment in the ongoing battle between the Lenox Street Boys and law enforcement. Federal charges were filed against 19 individuals, many of whom faced accusations of distributing illicit substances within 1,000 feet of public housing, a charge that carried serious legal consequences. The extensive raids not only brought several key members of the gang into custody, but also underscored the persistent problem of gun violence and drug trafficking in Boston's South End. Despite these arrests, the Lenox Street Boys' story didn't end with the 2016 raids. Their criminal activity had deep roots, and the gang's ability to bounce back was a pathway to its enduring presence. However, as law enforcement focused more attention on the gang, it became increasingly difficult for the Lenox Street Boys to operate with the same level of control. The arrests and indictments in both federal and state courts crippled the gang's ability to continue its illicit empire as effectively as it had in the past. The downfall of the Lenox Street Boys came not only from the arrests, but also from internal struggles and external pressure. With several members facing lengthy prison sentences and others being cut off from their networks, the gang found itself fractured. The once powerful organization that had terrorized neighborhoods and forged a path through criminal activity was slowly dismantled by law enforcement and the passage of time. Number 5. H-Block Gang. The H-Block Gang, one of the most feared and influential gangs in Boston, traces its origins to the 1980s when it was initially known as the Humboldt Raiders. Based in the Roxbury section of Boston, the gang re-emerged in the 2000s as H-Block, taking its name from the street it operated on. Over the decades, the gang's activities have been marked by a history of violence, drug trafficking, and constant confrontations with law enforcement. Forming out of the chaos of the 1980s, the gang quickly became notorious for its stronghold in Roxbury and its capacity to thrive in an environment shaped by socioeconomic challenges. The H-Block Gang, in its reemergence, maintained a tight grip on the local streets of Boston. The gang's members were known to be deeply embedded in narcotics distribution, illicit activities, and violent disputes. These disputes weren't limited to turf wars, but spilled into clashes with rival gangs, most notably the Heath Street gang, which led to a long-running and deadly feud that gripped the city for years. A defining feature of H-Block's operations was its unwavering control over narcotic trade routes and illicit substances smuggled into Massachusetts prisons. The gang, using its influence and connections, expanded its criminal empire well beyond the confines of Boston's borders. The violence linked to their activities wasn't just confined to street corners, it reached further, spilling over into violent confrontations with law enforcement officers. A memorable incident occurred in 2015 when an H-Block member shot a Boston police officer without provocation, showcasing the gang's boldness and disregard for authority. The rise of the H-Block Gang wasn't without its toll on the community. In 2021, a multi-year investigation into their activities uncovered a disturbing reality. Not only were the gang's members involved in the street-level distribution of narcotics, but they were also heavily engaged in the trafficking of illegal substances into the state's prisons. H-Block members utilized creative methods, such as sending narcotic-laced sheets of paper disguised as legal correspondence, to smuggle synthetic cannabinoids and other illicit substances into correctional facilities. One sheet of narcotic-laced paper, according to authorities, could fetch as much as $80,000 inside prison walls, indicating the extent to which the gang had entrenched itself in Boston's criminal underworld. The gang's connection to narcotics trafficking was deeply intertwined with the personal criminal histories of its members. Avery Lewis, a known member of the H-Block Gang, was a regular player in the gang's illicit substance trade, selling narcotics to undercover officers. His arrest in 2024, alongside several others, underscored the significant threat H-Block posed. Lewis, known on the streets as Wave, pleaded guilty to narcotic conspiracy charges in January 2025, which was part of a larger federal crackdown on the gang. This move was a response to the surge in gang-related violence and narcotic trafficking, which had become a serious public safety issue in Boston. Lewis's arrest, alongside the indictment of other H-Block members in 2024, was a turning point in the battle against gang violence in Boston. Law enforcement, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and local police, had spent years piecing together the gang's operations. By the time charges were filed, the H-Block gang's tentacles had reached deep into the fabric of Boston's criminal economy. The gang's activities weren't just limited to narcotics. Its members were also involved in firearms trafficking and conspiracies to defraud financial institutions, all of which painted a clear picture of a criminal organization operating with near impunity. One of the defining traits of H-Block was its violence, which spilled over from their narcotics dealings. A tragic example was the 2006 shooting demise of H-Block leader Jamal Norfleet, who had previously attempted to broker peace between rival gangs in the city. Despite his efforts to negotiate a ceasefire, Norfleet's life was tragically cut short. His demise was a blow to the gang's internal structure, did little to slow the violence. In fact, it spurred further conflicts between H-Block and rival factions, including the Heath Street gang. The conflict became a cycle of retaliation and violence, a characteristic that became a hallmark of the H-Block gang's legacy. As authorities closed in on the gang, the narrative of its members' arrests and prosecutions became a significant chapter in Boston's fight against gang violence. In 2024, H-Block members faced a series of charges, from narcotic trafficking to firearms possession and mail fraud schemes. This crackdown marked a pivotal moment in the attempt to dismantle the gang's operations. 6 members were arrested for dealing narcotics, and several others were implicated in smuggling narcotics into prisons or laundering money through fraudulent schemes. The scope of the gang's criminal enterprise made clear that its influence stretched far beyond the streets of Boston, with some members facing up to 20 years in federal prison. Despite these setbacks, the legacy of the H-Block gang remains. While the gang's operations were significantly disrupted, their history and influence cannot be erased so easily. Number 4. Heath Street Gang. The Heath Street Gang, a notorious organization in Boston, rose from the underbelly of the city's Jamaica Plain neighborhood, where it wreaked havoc and solidified its grip on the surrounding areas for decades. Operating mainly out of the Mildred C. Haley Apartments, formerly known as the Bromley Heath Housing Development, the gang has been a powerful force, instilling fear in local communities and creating an ongoing cycle of violence, crime, and destruction. Formed during the 1980s, the Heath Street Gang initially gained traction through acts of violence and criminality to assert control over their territory. As time passed, their influence grew, and by the early 2000s, they had expanded their operations. The gang is said to have over 150 members and a network of associates, many of whom were heavily involved in illicit activities ranging from narcotic distribution to violent clashes with rival groups. One of their fiercest adversaries was the Mission Hill Gang, with whom they had a long-standing feud, marked by shootouts, intimidation, and aggressive territorial expansion. A key element of the gang's operations was their strategic use of local youth. Many of the gang's recruits were young people from the nearby housing development, a vulnerable demographic that the gang used to carry out violent acts and illicit deals. Juveniles were often pressured into committing acts of violence to prove their loyalty, a grim initiation process that helped solidify the gang's power. The gang's leader, alongside senior members, exploited these youths as they engaged in shootings, trafficking narcotics, and taking part in robberies. One of the gang's most heinous acts occurred in October 2016, when a shooting allegedly orchestrated by Heath Street members left a 9-year-old girl severely injured. The attack was said to be a result of a violent confrontation with rival gang members in Mission Hill's territory. The girl was an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of this ongoing gang rivalry. In 2021, the violence continued, with a juvenile member of the gang allegedly involved in the demise of a rival gang member. Such attacks weren't just confined to the streets. They also infiltrated social spaces, creating an atmosphere of fear and lawlessness. Members of the gang would brazenly flaunt their power, using social media to advertise their illicit activities and even making references to their criminal endeavors. One such video included a chilling line where a gang member referred to a manslaughter, stating, "I can say the names, but it might make the feds come for us." This public display of violence was not just an exercise in bravado. It was part of a larger effort by the gang to solidify their dominance in the narcotic trade. The Heath Street gang established elaborate distribution networks for narcotics that spanned beyond Boston, stretching into areas such as Maine and California. Narcotics were trafficked through these channels, and social media platforms were used to negotiate sales and arrange transactions. The gang's control over narcotic distribution made them a key player in the region's narcotics market, further entrenching their criminal influence. As the gang expanded its reach, so did their criminal activity. The gang's involvement in organized retail theft became another avenue for them to generate funds. Beginning in 2019, members of the Heath Street gang were implicated in brazen thefts from high-end stores across Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Their thefts weren't just opportunistic, they were calculated, with some gang members using violence to intimidate store employees and security personnel. Retail theft became another source of revenue for the gang as they sought to expand their criminal empire. But it wasn't just physical crimes that defined the Heath Street gang. They were also involved in various financial fraud schemes, including frauds related to COVID relief programs. The gang exploited the government's pandemic-related aid, siphoning off millions of dollars intended for struggling individuals and businesses. Using fraudulent applications for loans and unemployment benefits, they enriched themselves at the expense of those in need. This added a new dimension to their criminal empire, blending traditional gang violence with sophisticated financial crimes. The long-running criminal activities of the Heath Street gang didn't go unnoticed for long. In February 2024, a multi-year investigation culminated in the arrest of over 40 members and associates of the gang. The investigation was spearheaded by federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local police. The charges ranged from racketeering and conspiracy to narcotic trafficking, firearms offenses, and financial fraud. These arrests represented a significant blow to the gang's operations, but they also exposed the full extent of the damage they had caused over the years. The gang's leaders were swiftly indicted, and many members faced multiple charges, some carrying decades-long prison sentences. Federal prosecutors focused on dismantling the entire criminal enterprise, targeting those responsible for the violence, narcotic trafficking, and financial fraud. In total, more than 60 firearms were seized during the investigation, including fully automatic weapons that had been used in violent incidents across Boston. The arrests sent a clear message to other criminal organizations in the city. The authorities were committed to putting an end to their reign of terror. Number 3. Columbia Point Dogs. The Columbia Point Dogs are one of Boston's most notorious and dangerous criminal organizations, rooted in the city's history and deeply ingrained in its criminal landscape. Emerging in the 1980s from the Columbia Point housing development in Dorchester, this gang became synonymous with the illicit trade of narcotics and violence, marking them as a significant threat to public safety in Boston and beyond. The Columbia Point Dogs were not just any gang. They were a force to be reckoned with, dominating the streets and spreading their influence across the entire New England region. The origins of the Columbia Point Dogs date back to the construction of the Columbia Point housing project in 1954. Over time, this public housing complex became one of the most dangerous in the United States, with a reputation steeped in criminal activities. When the housing project was raised in the 1980s to make way for the Harbor Point mixed-income development, the gang members moved and adapted, ensuring their criminal operation continued undeterred. The members were highly identifiable by their choice of clothing, often donning hats with the logos of the Pittsburgh Pirates and Philadelphia Phillies, a trademark that came to symbolize their stronghold in the Dorchester area. The CPD, initially formed by a collection of families, most notably the Williams, Woods, Berry, and Funches families, established their dominance early on. Their activities revolved heavily around the distribution of narcotics across Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. They cultivated an image of wealth and power, often flaunting their fortunes with luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and by spending lavishly at nightclubs. They were deeply involved in the narcotics trade, with the gang's activities stretching from Boston to southern parts of New England, making them key players in the regional drug scene. Their power was not limited to street-level narcotic sales. By the 1990s, they had expanded their reach into other states, trafficking narcotics across southern Massachusetts, into Maine, and down the East Coast. As they solidified their grip on the narcotic trade, they grew increasingly violent, and their conflict with rival gangs, particularly the Greenwood Street Posse, escalated into open confrontations, often resulting in shootings and other acts of aggression. One particularly infamous episode of CPD's violent history occurred in 1995 when Bobby Brown, the famed singer, was in Boston. While visiting a nightclub, a member of a rival gang reportedly targeted Bobby's companion, Stephen Seeley, shooting him while he was seated in Whitney Houston's car. Despite the increasing law enforcement attention, the Columbia Point Dogs continued to thrive well into the 2000s. However, by the mid-2010s, their activities would finally catch up with them. A 2-year investigation, known as Operation Rising Tide, involved hundreds of law enforcement officers from federal, state, and local agencies. In 2015, 48 individuals linked to the CPD were arrested on charges related to narcotic trafficking and firearms offenses. During this operation, law enforcement seized over 30 firearms, including high-powered weapons, as well as large quantities of illicit narcotics, nearly $1.5 million in cash. Among those arrested during Operation Rising Tide was Willie Berry, who had been identified as a leader of the gang. Berry was sentenced in 2017 after pleading guilty to multiple charges, including conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The CPD's activities didn't stop at narcotics distribution. The gang also engaged in a variety of other illegal enterprises, including extortion and racketeering. They even created a record label, 8 Bus Records, to further their influence in the entertainment industry. The label became a front for promoting their illegal activities, often using it to promote their notoriety and demand payments from visiting artists in exchange for protection to perform in Boston. Number 1. Patriarca Crime Family. In the early 20th century, the streets of Boston and Providence bore witness to the rise of a formidable force in organized crime. The Patriarca crime family, also known as the New England Mafia. This syndicate, with its roots deeply embedded in the Italian-American communities, wove a complex tale of illicit activities and power struggles that left an indelible mark on New England's underworld. The origins of this crime family trace back to 2 distinct factions. In Boston, Gaspare Di Cola led a burgeoning group until his untimely demise in 1916. Meanwhile, Providence saw the emergence of a parallel faction under Frank Morelli in 1917. These 2 groups operated independently, each vying for control over lucrative enterprises such as bootlegging and illegal gambling. The landscape shifted in 1932 when Filippo Bucola, a dominant figure from East Boston, orchestrated a merger of the Boston and Providence factions, forming what would become the New England crime family. Bucola's reign was marked by ruthless eliminations of rivals, solidifying the family's dominance in the region. However, it was Raymond Loreda Salvatore Patriarca who would elevate the family's influence to unprecedented heights. Assuming leadership in 1954, Patriarca relocated the family's base to Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood. Operating under the guise of the National Cigarette Service Company, he transformed the organization into a well-oiled machine, extending its reach across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The family's portfolio expanded to include illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the distribution of illicit goods. Notably, Patriarca held a stake in the Dunes Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, profiting from the clandestine skimming of its revenues. Under Patriarca's astute leadership, the family thrived, boasting over 100 made men at its zenith. His strategic alliances with powerful New York crime families, such as the Genovese and Colombo families, fortified his position, ensuring a steady flow of resources and mutual protection. These affiliations not only expanded the family's operational territory, but also integrated them into the broader tapestry of the American Mafia. The family's operations were vast and varied. They maintained a stranglehold on illegal gambling rings, orchestrated extensive loan sharking schemes, and trafficked in stolen goods. Their influence permeated various sectors, from local businesses to major entertainment venues. However, the family's criminal endeavors were not without consequence. Law enforcement agencies, both local and federal, were perpetually on their trail. Surveillance operations, wiretaps, and undercover agents sought to dismantle the family's operations. Despite these efforts, the family's deep-rooted connections and strategic bribery often kept them one step ahead, evading significant legal repercussions for decades. The turning point came with Patriarca's demise in 1984. His son, Raymond Patriarca Jr., assumed control but lacked his father's authoritative presence. Internal dissent festered, leading to an attempted coup by Joseph J.R. Russo of the Boston faction in the late 1980s. This internal strife, coupled with aggressive law enforcement tactics, culminated in a series of indictments in 1990. Patriarca Jr., Russo, and numerous associates faced charges under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RACO) Act, leading to substantial prison sentences. The 1990s ushered in further turmoil. Frank Salemme emerged as a leader, but his tenure was marred by internal warfare. A renegade faction, spearheaded by Robert F. Carosa, challenged Salemme's authority, resulting in violent confrontations and further destabilization. Both Salemme and Carosa eventually found themselves incarcerated, paving the way for Luigi Baby Shack Smanocchio to assume leadership in 1996, thereby returning the family's command center to Providence. And in recent years, the family's influence has waned considerably. As of 2012, their ranks had diminished to approximately 30 made members. Leadership transitions continued, with Carmen the Cheeseman D'Annunzio from the Boston faction taking the helm.